Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics, and this is the Kriss Vector SDP in 9mm. I first saw the Kriss Vector in a gun magazine probably about 10, maybe longer, years ago. Came out initially, I believe, in 45, and of course the design is very eye-catching because until you actually start reading up on it, you don't know why it's shaped the way it is shaped. The reason it's shaped that way is because of their patented proprietary Recoil Mitigation system, the Super V system, which we'll get into a little bit. Because it came in 45 and because I wasn't really interested in purchasing a pistol caliber carbine, back that far back then, that term wasn't even really in vogue, if you will. I didn't pick one up. When they finally started producing them in 9mm, I was like, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and grab one of these and check it out and see what it's like. I'd had some experience with them before. I'd had students that had them in classes, and I've fired them at range days, SHOT Show, things like that. But I hadn't put a lot of considerable time on the Kriss Vector platform to see if it is beneficial versus some of the other stuff that's out there. So I definitely wanted to check one out. So I went ahead and grabbed one in OD green, because OD green is the best green, to see if it was really everything the hype says it is. So getting right into some of the features of the Kriss Vector. It uses Kriss's patented Super V recoil mitigation system, which we're going to get into later. The one I got came with a 6.5-inch threaded barrel in 9mm. It has toolless caliber and changeability, so you can actually change out the barrel and the operating system for different calibers if that's something that you want to do. It is Glock magazine compatible, so anything that's Glock 17 or longer, such as the Glock 18 mags or any of your high capacity, what I would consider high capacity over the standard capacity 17 or 22 rounds, is going to feed fine. During the review process, I used Magpul magazines. I also used Glock OEM magazines, and I had no issues whatsoever. I also used Kriss's extension kits for the Glock 17 mag to give you about 40 rounds. Those worked flawlessly in regards to magazine performance. It comes with polymer sights, and it's got an ambidextrous safety selector, and it's a short throw, which I really did like that a lot. It's a very intuitive placement for thumb activation. It's not really that big of a deal, working from left or right shoulder. Not a big deal. In fact, I'm usually not a fan of Ambi Selectors because usually they just can't get the job done. Or I should say, you can get the job done with a left hand only or a right hand only selector just as well as you can with an Ambi, and Ambis sometimes catch on gear unless you outboard the weapon. So that's a safety issue as far as I'm concerned. Of course, there's plenty of ways to get around that, but it's just not something I prefer, especially since I can get the same results at the same speed without putting an Ambi device on my gun. I don't believe we should add Ambi things to our firearms just because we can. It is toolless disassembly, which, you know, that's what I come to expect from most of the platforms that are out there. I mean, you know, you look at AR-centric and some of the other systems that are out there, you don't really need tools to take them apart down to a level where general maintenance is going to be done. This particular one has a folding stock, which can be, you know, reverse, left, or right. You have that option. As far as the other controls go, that's kind of where my gripe begins. The Ambi Selector is great. You know, it's very intuitive. I'm glad it's there because if I was going to use a left side only selector for shooting right-handed and I was to shoot left-handed, it would be a little bit problematic to sweep that selector with my index finger. Still possible, but not quite the same ease of access ergonomics that you get from an AR. The bolt catch, bolt release is in a very particular place. I bring that up because if your hand placement isn't perfect on the front of the firearm, you may inadvertently put your thumb in a place where it's going to hold that bolt catch. So when you fire that round, the bolt's going to lock to the rear and empty because the gun is, you know, it's a mechanical object. It's like, oh, he's trying to hold the bolt to the rear. So your hand placement has to be very, very specific. You either have to ride the thumb very, very forward, or you have to bring the thumb well below that bolt catch, bolt release. Not exactly a big fan of that. I like to put my support hand where it needs to go, not where the weapon demands it to be, because my support hand placement is going to be dependent on what I'm actually doing with the firearm. Because this doesn't have a traditional monolithic rail, an uninterrupted platform like you'd see from a traditional rifle or even a traditional submachine gun, hand placement is at a premium on this. I've got a 6.5-inch barrel. I've got very little rail space here, so I don't have a lot of other options for hand placement. I could, of course, put a forward grip on it, but that's going to limit my options as well as far as hand placement goes because of the limited rail space. So it's not a huge issue. It's something that you definitely have to train and practice for. If you're going to use this as a hobby gun, it's probably going to frustrate you occasionally. If you're going to use one of these for duty purposes or home defense purposes or self-defense purposes, you definitely have to train in the ability to make sure that you're placing your hand specifically right where it needs to be, because you don't have a lot of room for error. You go too low, of course, you compromise your grip. You go too high, you might place your thumb or even the meat palm of your hand in a place where it's going to ride on that bolt release, bolt catch in a way that it's going to cause the firearm to interrupt the cycle of fire or malfunction. The next issue is the charging handle, which I don't really necessarily have an issue with it. Maybe that's the wrong word to use. But it is very, very close to interacting with any potential accessories that you mount on the firearm. So I mounted a mod light, and I mounted it for thumb activation, so it's on the left side of the firearm. So it is very, very close to where I'm going to have to be manipulating that charging handle, as well as my sling mount. If I was going to run a single point sling, wouldn't be a big deal. I don't like single point slings, so I'm going to put a 2-point sling on it. In fact, the reason I got this version with the forward rail interfaces is so I could run a 2-point sling, and so I had just a little bit more barrel length, and I hoped more real estate for hand placement options depending on what type of shooting I'm doing. My final little complaint is the magazine release. Again, not a big deal, but its placement requires a complete compromise of the support hand grip. Like I said, it's not a big deal because you're going to compromise your support hand grip reloading anyway. So its placement isn't terrible. However, it's problematic and it's not reversible. So if you are left-handed, that is going to be an issue. My biggest issue, I guess, with it is the fact that it does sit under where my hand is going to be placed versus near it. Most firearms, the support hand or the primary hand doesn't come anywhere near in contact with the magazine release until it's time to hit the magazine release. So potentially while wearing gloves or something like that, you could inadvertently press the magazine release, which I did once during the review process. I was really bearing down on the gun because I was running a higher string, a higher cadence of fire, and the magazine fell out. That's a potential issue, so it's something that you have to be aware of, and it's definitely something that you have to contend with. You can't really run a larger or a more prominent magazine release on this because you're definitely going to be hitting it if you come out of that recess that the OEM magazine release sits in. So what about performance? Well, starting things out like I do with every single 2,000 round review process I'm going to do is the 500 round burn down. Once I got my optic mounted and got it zeroed, I put 500 rounds through the Kriss SDP as fast as possible to accelerate rate of fire to see if accelerated rate of fire would cause any issues with the firearm that you wouldn't necessarily notice at a lower rate of shooting. So without further ado, here is your 500 round burn down. I did have a stovepipe during the review, or I should say during the burn down. Stovepipe actually caught right in the chamber. I was able to clear it, get back to shooting. So 499 rounds flawlessly, 1 round stovepipe. I figured that was a one-off. It can happen. It's not the end of the world. All firearms eventually are going to have some kind of malfunction occur. So I didn't really think too much of it until I got into the last 1,500 rounds. I kept having stovepipes. Many of them I caught on film. In fact, one magazine I had multiple stovepipes. So throughout the 2,000 round review process, I had 25 stovepipes. That is not good math. And of course, this is across a couple different types of ammunition, so it wasn't just happening on one brand. I shot 115 Fiocchi. I also shot 124 Gecko, and of course, my venerable, always shooting 124 and 124 plus Pete Gold Dot. Those are the 4 ammunitions that were fired through this firearm during the review process, 2,000 rounds with 25 stovepipes. That's problematic. I bring that up because I haven't seen in recent, I'm just trying to recall, I haven't used any new firearm that is stovepiped to that degree. So is that just an issue, a one-off sample size of 1 with this particular firearm? I broke it down, checked the extractor. I didn't see anything that should be causing that in a 2,000 round cycle of fire. So is it something inherent with the design? I don't necessarily know. I did some looking on the internet. Of course, you got to take what you find on the internet with a very, very large grain of salt. But I did see that there are people out there talking about, especially with the new, even with the newer generation, there being stovepipe issues in certain situations with certain types of ammunition. So in the future, I'm going to obviously keep shooting it for, you know, however long. I'm going to try some different types of ammunition and see if it's just ammunition specific. Even if it is, it doesn't like those 4 kinds of ammo. Those aren't reload crap, garbage, garage bullets. They're factory ammunition. Most of they're basically 3 brands of ammunition that I use quite frequently, and I have not seen them cause performance issues to that degree, not even nearly to that degree, in other firearms. So I'm inclined at this point to say that there's something going on with the firearm, not necessarily the ammunition, to have 25 stovepipes in 2,000 rounds. Is the stovepiping the end of the world? No, but maybe. In fact, one particular stovepipe required me to break the firearm down to clear it, just based on the way that the chamber interface works with the furniture. So that gives me pause, but continue the review process. Other performance, how about accuracy? Did a 25 yard zero initially, 5-round group shooting 124 grain Gold Dot. That's the ammunition that I chose to zero it on. So here's your 5-round group for zeroing in accuracy purposes. For a 6.5-inch barrel, especially shoulder supported, that's an excellent group shooting good quality, high quality 9mm ammunition. I wouldn't expect any less than that. 25 is generally considered a good distance for accuracy at checking on submachine guns / pistol caliber carbines / pistols. But I wanted to see what it was actually capable of. So I went ahead and got a group on paper, also on paper, at 50 yards to see how much, if any, that group was going to fall apart when we doubled the distance. I would call that very respectable performance out of this barrel length. Again, shoulder supported definitely adds my ability to be accurate. Quality optics, not using iron sights, things of that nature do allow me to be more inherently accurate. But at 50 yards with a pistol caliber carbine, shooting that kind of group at 50 yards, I'm pretty happy with the accuracy. In fact, so far during my 2,000 rounds, the accuracy is my favorite part of the SDP. Also spent a good deal of time shooting suppressed. About 500 rounds were fired suppressed during the review process, and it functions fine, suppressed, caveat, of course. During the suppressed portion, I think I had three or four stovepipes, 25 total, but 3 or 4 when I actually had a suppressor on it. I shot it with the Omega 9K as well as the Dead Air Wolfman in the K configuration, or the shorter configuration, because I like short suppressors on handguns and pistol caliber carbines. Working it into my general training and practice, reloading is not that big of a deal once you get used to it. Again, I don't really care for the placement of that magazine release, but it was easy, intuitive to hit the magazine release once you built the myelination into, okay, this is where my hand needs to go to hit that magazine release. This is the place I got to be. So reloading at that point became very, very similar to an AR, with the added benefit of the magazines are longer if you're shooting 31, 32, or the 40-round magazines. So you've got a lot more runway, a lot more room for control and correcting and get that magazine into the magazine well and putting the firearm back into use. As long as you don't interrupt the cycle of fire by putting your hand in the wrong place and hitting that bolt catch, it locked back reliably every single time on an empty magazine. Some magazines did not want to drop free. The Glock OD green ones, they had to be stripped out, but any OEM Glock magazine that was black in color fell out just fine. Magpul were inconsistently sticky, so if you're going to use Magpul magazines, just be aware that you may have to strip the mag. My advice to anyone using this system is to not skimp and actually buy 30-round plus magazines for it, so it works a little bit more like a rifle, so you're not trying to fight with OEM floor plate mags or just magazines that have +3s or +5s on them. A quick word on the trigger. The trigger is something I definitely actually liked a lot. And I was surprised by that because a lot of, not all, but a lot of the pistol caliber carbines or SBR 9mm SMGs, whatever you want to call them, whatever your terminology is, something like this, their triggers are generally gritty and not, I guess, beneficial for what I'm trying to do with them. I don't like them. They're either too heavy, or they have too much play or too much travel in them, or they don't reset in a way that I like when I'm shooting for precision. This particular trigger I actually like a lot. It's got a real clean break, and it's got a positive reset if I'm riding reset, but I can also run this trigger faster than comparable polymer triggers and even metal triggers that I've used in the past on other similar firearms. So the trigger is definitely a favorite of mine. I do like it a lot. I would like to see it be maybe a little bit lighter, but again, that's user preference. But I think for the particular configuration of this firearm, this trigger definitely is a benefit to the overall features. Reliability was probably my biggest complaint, and in 25 stovepipes, you know, it keeps coming up. That's an issue. Now, what about the recoil system? Does I should say, the Kriss Super V recoil mitigation system provide a significant enough benefit to make this a PCC to look at? Well, I will say this. I've spent a lot of time shooting a lot of different submachine guns, both professionally and personally. I own quite a few. When I was in law enforcement, I had to use the MP5 for a number of years, and that usually, for some crazy reason, is the gold standard for submachine guns, which would have totally made sense 30, 40 years ago. Not so much today, but people still use it as the gold standard for some reason. The recoil mitigation is real. Across those 4 different types of ammunitions I fired, 124, 115, 124 gold dot, and 124 plus P, I do notice a perceptible and noticeable lack of muzzle rise compared to shooting those same ammunitions through traditional recoil systems, roller lock or direct blowback or delayed blowback submachine guns. So there is something to the system. I think it would probably be more beneficial in a different caliber, such as 40 cal, 10mm, maybe even 45. But it's definitely there. It's definitely something that is happening. Unfortunately, what I think is because of the nature of the design of the Super V and the way that the furniture interacts with the chamber and the bolt carrier, the firearm does lend itself more to having stovepipe issues, which is the only malfunction that I had happen during the review process. So that gives me a little bit of pause. I think that there's room for improvement. I think that they can open that area up a little bit more, maybe supercharge that extractor to mitigate or prevent that from being an issue. The problem with stovepipes is they're not predictable, and depending on the environment or the nature in which the firearm is being used, they can be somewhat cumbersome, especially just based on the design. If the stovepipe locks the gun up to a degree to where it's going to be quicker to take it apart to fix it than it is going to be to get a pair of pliers to try to pry that casing out of there. Aggravation on the range, kind of a big deal if it's due to your home defense purposes. So that's something that we definitely want to pay attention to. And I don't want to add a whole lot of hyperbole to this. I don't think it's a catastrophic issue, and I don't think it's the end of the world, and I don't think it should dissuade you from purchasing one. But again, sample size of 1, it is something to be aware of. Overall, I thought the Kriss was good. It's a good choice for a submachine gun or a PCC or a pistol. If you're not going to SBR it. Would it be something that I would choose over other things that are out there? Probably not. The biggest benefit for me was that recoil mitigation, and I don't feel, especially 9mm, that's just large enough a gain for me to add potential issues because of the operating system. I think the operating system does as designed. It definitely helps redirect the energy of the recoil in a way that makes the firearm shoot flatter than a comparable barrel length PCC, SMG, whatever you want to call it. That being said, that recoil is not significant enough for me to want to change over to a system that is, I wouldn't say unproven, but just based on my sample size of 1 experience, more problematic than what I've used in the past. I'm Eric Count with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.